Welcome to the Stories of Christmas podcast. My name is MyLinda Butterworth, and I will be your teller of tales during this festive season. Today, we are off to the Middle East, where we meet Nasruddin, a good fellow who doesn't always make the wisest decisions, as you'll see by his behavior when he attends a royal feast, and Mullah Nasruddin and the feast, as told by MyLinda Butterworth. Mullah Nasruddin was sometimes a wise man and sometimes a fool. I will leave it up to you to decide which he is in this story. But he is always watchful and kind. You see, it happened to be on a fine fall day when he was traveling home from a trip that he heard that there was to be a great feast in town, and that we're all invited to attend. And since Nasruddin loved food, it is something he was not about to forget. As he passed through the town gates, he observed two children chasing after a drove of goats, trying to get them into the pen without any luck. In fact, it was going very badly, for they were knocking over the laundry, eating vegetables out of the baskets. They were creating quite a scene. Nasruddin sat on his faithful donkey for a moment, trying to figure out how he could help, when he had a brilliant idea. He slowly climbed off his donkey and had the children bring him a basket. He then produced a round of bread, which he broke into small pieces and put them in the basket. Then he handed each child a handful of bread pieces and told them to quietly offer them to the goats to coax them back home. He then began to make a path of bread back to the pen, to where he placed the rest of the bread in a pile. The bread path worked like a charm, and before you knew it, all the goats were back in the pen but one, who before going in knocked poor Nasruddin over and took the last piece of bread he had from his hand. The children helped Nasruddin up and thanked him for his help. It was now late. Nasruddin had dust all over his clothes, but he wanted to get to the feast sooner than later, so he dusted himself off and approached the feast hall. Standing at the door of the feast hall was a rather large guard who looked at Nasruddin with disdain, for he did not look or smell good. The visiting prince had proclaimed that all were welcome to the feast regardless of their station in life. Nasruddin was led into the banquet hall and sat at a table in the back of the room, where few would see or smell him. The smell of food wafting through the air was delightful, and he could hardly wait for the plate of food to make it to him. But when it got there, only crumbs were left. After this happened a couple of times, he decided to go home, but not before noticing that all the best food was going to the well-dressed people in the room, and the prince was at the head of the table. Nasruddin left quickly, went home, had a scented bath drawn for him, and requested his best clothes be brought to him straight away. When his bath was over, he put on his best coat and turban and went straight back to the feast hall. Nasruddin strutted up to the guard, who thought he was someone important, and bowed to him. He then escorted his elegantly dressed guest to the head table, where he sat him close to the visiting prince. Before long, servants brought large platters of spiced meat, seasoned vegetables, breads, fruits, nuts, sweetmeats, and other delicacies were put before him, and a large glass of wine was poured for him. Before Nasruddin began to fill his plate with food, he looked out over the hall and saw people from all walks of life and varying stations of importance. Some people he recognized and some he did not, but nobody knew who he was in his fancy clothes. and many people smiled and waved at him as if he was someone of great importance. Nasruddin spent a few minutes talking politely with the prince about trivial things, and then began putting food on his plate. While this was the normal thing to do, what he did next was completely unexpected. He grabbed a piece of eggplant and he smeared it on his beautiful coat. Then he took a handful of spiced lamb and he put it in the cuff of his coat. They didn't know what to think or say. Finally, Nasruddin took his glass of wine and he poured it through the folds of his turban. At this point, the prince could no longer be silent and said, "My elegant friend, why are you putting this fine food all over your beautiful clothes?" Nasruddin stopped feeding his coat, rose, bowing slightly to the prince for respect, and said, "When I first arrived, I was dusty and smelly, but the platters of food came by and they were empty and I was hungry. So I went home and I dressed in my very best clothes, which got me treated like royalty. I figured, since it was the coat that had gotten me such a prime seat at the table, perhaps I should feed it first." With that, the prince laughed and laughed and laughed and realized that if you're going to invite the whole town to feast with you, perhaps you should feed them all the same regardless of their appearance. And in the future, that is exactly what he did. And here is where I end my tale for today. But I'll be back with more stories, many more stories. Thanks for joining me today as we explore stories from around the world. If you enjoyed this story, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe. For more stories like this, check out the book Crazy About Christmas. Until then, enjoy everything the season has to offer. See you soon.